Hello, students. This is a first in a line of really great interviews we're going to do this semester. It's my honor to introduce a good friend and a great colleague, Thomas Schuttenhelm, a guitarist, composer, scholar, and artistic director of Network for New Music based in Philadelphia. Thank you so much, Thomas, for taking some time out of your day.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Great. Now, as we've spoken briefly, one of the things that we want to talk about is writing or arranging for guitar, which is a multifaceted idea, even let alone instrument, of thinking different variations of it. But one of the things I wanted to start off with is just what you love playing on your instrument.
Yeah. I easy answer. New music. I mean, it's the guitar really is the way I conceive of it. It really is it's in its golden era. That 20th, 21st century is, we've only just beginning to realize its possibilities, both solo and in ensemble. So I think it would just be discovering new sounds.
That's excellent. Now, is there a particular technique or style that you find yourself drawn to sonically or even as a player?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wouldn't say there's a particular style that I have a preference for. I guess if we think of contemporary music as a style, then I put it in that area. Just because of I think the instrument itself has developed. So like, unlike, let's say, the violin, which, we use essentially the same model for the violin as we did in the 17th century. So it's gone pretty much unchanged, right? It's got the same amount of strings, it's got the same tuning, it's got all of the constructional features. It's very similar now as to what it was back then. The guitar, it's really just a concept, right? There's no set standard number of strings. There's 5-string guitars, there's 6, 7, 10, 12 strings, right? We don't have that set. Tuning, also not set, right? The very construction of the instrument isn't set. Some have flat backs, some have round backs, some have just that the materials, all of those things influence the composition.
No, that's a really compelling idea. And I almost wonder if that more open-ended sense of what it actually is, what the instrument is, maybe plays into a different variety or a more laxed sense of what guitar music sounds like. And I'm thinking even more of, we have a whole other history that's just 100 years old, maybe, with electric guitar, to where we're changing repertoire altogether with how you write for the instrument. So I love that idea of construction of the instrument informing how we're writing for it and what kind of music goes along with it.
And related to that, like how the electric guitar is now becoming integrated into ensembles is very different from what it was in its, in the 1950s and 60s, when the electric guitar was relatively new. How the instrument is approached creatively and interpretively changes as sounds evolve. In this technological age where we can process sounds, every time you run that guitar through there, you essentially have a new instrument. To me, I find that incredibly exciting.
Oh, very, very interesting. So many colors available to us. Speaking of, just for our students in this class that I mentioned are all very, very new to composition or to arranging, what have you seen in your experience as a player, some missed opportunities or even some mishaps that you've encountered by composers or arrangers when writing for guitar, whether that's nylon string or some variations on acoustic or electric, just some missed opportunities that you feel like, oh, I wish they'd do more of that, or even just some mishaps in what you've seen written for the instrument?
Yeah, so the notation is a really tricky and idiosyncratic language, notation on guitar. And like how chords are voiced is quite different. I think one of the things is I'd recommend to the composers is, don't treat the instrument like a piano. right? Because it can't sustain. So, and every single note is struck. So like if you have a legato line, the player is really sort of creating that illusion. So be careful in your notations about how you're expressing the type of effect that you want. It's always good to check it out with a player. Lots of people have they have fretboards, and I'll work with a composer, and they'll be like, "Well, see, I can do it. It's possible." Like, yes, that's possible. But when you ask for quarter note equals 120, and you wrote that as a 16th note, so actually getting that becomes a matter of choreography. And that can be like something that's really frustrating with guitar, or it can be something that's really, really wonderful about it. Is how that chord is played and how it is placed can be always be interpreted on the guitar.
Sure, there could be in some instances there could be multiple places on the instrument to play that same voicing, and maybe context will derive what works best, as opposed to a particular fret on one string as opposed to higher up on a different string maybe.
Exactly, Matt. That's exactly it. And I think it's always just like exploring, having the player. And what I find so it's really exciting in terms of writing for it is that you look at a chord and you're right, it can be played here and here, but if I play it down here, it feels like a whole different piece.
Sure.
And then to gauge your interpretation from that placement, and just hearing the different sounds versus the closed, maybe open string or closed strings, is again, to me, is so incredibly inviting and exciting, but it can be really difficult when you're trying to write for it. So I
Sure.
guess I would be if you can, always check a voicing out with a player, and try it out, and just be aware that it is a for a sustaining instrument, it doesn't quite have that strength of the bow. If you think of it as a string instrument, right, they can just sustain through. We pluck, and the envelope, the decay,
Yeah.
pretty sharp.
Mm-hmm.
The descent is steep. So being
Sure.
aware of how much the guitar can sustain, and along those lines, when it's playing with other instruments, can it be heard through that texture?
I think that balance would probably be an issue, especially outside of chamber music, which I know is a place that we see,
Yeah.
especially nylon string guitar, a lot of. We see a lot of small group chamber music, but in ensemble, that's a different issue with balance. Um, I wonder, just to build upon that,
Mhm.
anything else you can say to maybe add to that idea of exploring different timbres on the instruments, or things that you might recommend composers or arrangers look into to kind of help guide their exploration?
Yeah, it's always good to have a player as a friend and colleague, so that I'm always going to encourage people to pair up with someone and work with someone. It's also, as a player, it's incredibly satisfying to work with players, because I mean, composers, what they've done for me is, like, as a player, my hands might gravitate towards playing in a certain way, but what composers do is they find entirely new voicings on a guitar that I would never think of, because if I'm thinking of the just the feel of it, I'm like, oh, I never thought of putting it here. I never dreamed of that. It sort of reminds me of the Stravinsky violin concerto.
Mhm.
That chord, that it's yeah, it's this DEA. I don't know if you
Yeah.
hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, when Stravinsky showed that to Duskin, he was like, can't be done.
It's impossible. Yeah.
Yeah, and he looks it over and he's like, oh, yeah, I guess it can, right? And now it's that sort of iconic sound.
Mhm.
Um, the what is it? The Barrio sequenza
Sequenza. Yeah.
for guitar is like
Mhm.
that. I mean, you look at that chord. It's a let's see, it's a low D. Sorry, low E. the low E, then a D sharp,
Sure.
A, B, and a harmonic on the E.
Sure.
And it's, it's a beautiful sound, just,
Mhm.
and then to get that harmonic up there, it's really, it separates, it should be one chord. So if I
Mhm.
voice it down here, and then, boy, that's a whole other,
Way different because the original version, it's such an easy job for your fretting hand. Left hand is so very, very easy on that original version of the chord, but the division of labor changes whenever you're not doing the tap and you're actually reaching out that pinky to make it happen. That it's a completely different feel for the player, and the sound is different. The entire timbral idea just happens to be different, even if all the pitch classes are the same.
exactly. And it's just like what you can realize is that chord there kind of gives birth to the whole piece, and you hear that chord over and over again. So its sound really does have to be striking to the ear to go, oh, that stands out. And I think how one interprets chords and notates chords, like in your piece, Matt, what's really interesting about that is how you have the chords, the direction of the chords. So like when we play the opening D, on with the A on top, but then you have me play the A back. So from the
Sure.
high string
Down.
to the
Yeah.
low string, and so to me in my ear, it's like that A and then that A, and I just
Yeah.
these things help like interpret. They help give me a sense of how to interpret. And then just like, I mean, even the way you've put your chords there too, I can't help but think,
Sure.
the
There's
Sati,
definitely little bits of that.
the
You could
Sati,
say
I just
there's
love it.
well, it was so funny whenever I was doing that too, for that miniature. Yeah, I definitely get the satie in there as well, but for some reason there was also like 1970s folk rock in there as well. Like America for some reason came up in my mind. Like those are like America kind of chords. And it's like what I'm actually hearing as, a an amateur guitarist with very minimal background was usually a combination of several guitar parts. So I had to figure out how could I make that work with just one. So I love that that's sort of a vibe that's coming off subconsciously, or that's a part of that. But
No,
uh,
the way you notated that too is really wonderful, because it gives both possibility in
sure,
where to voice and how to play it, but it does sort of make us hear those references
sure.
that you were just speaking of. And I like too how the guitar players, since we can't sustain, that you kind of built sustain in there, so I can have those other strings ringing
Sure.
while I'm reaching up, and I don't have to mute it, so there isn't that silence in between. And I think
Hmm.
that kind of notation, the polyphony, is really, really good what you did to way to help us hear a sustain by allowing the open strings to ring, because you have these two ringing, so we can come up and have them ringing while I'm changing position. That just shows a really well-written piece. It fits well under the instrument. Again, it allows for different kinds of interpreting.
Sure. Well, thank you for that. That really means the world to me. I know uh, a lot of times you deal with the same issues on other sustaining instruments as well. So you think of how can I use open strings to sort of mask some of these other ideas. It's almost like good blocking in theater, to where
Yeah.
like there's such a a process is going on, but it doesn't have to necessarily be heard. It can be seen, but it doesn't have to be heard that way. So I always think about that whenever you have to have big shifts, no matter the string instruments or even sometimes in piano as well, or percussion. One of the things I think that would be really helpful in this series is giving these young students some pieces that you might recommend for them to study, what feels like really solid writing for you as a player, but just also to see how your instrument works really well. I always tell them to uh, we build on this idea or concept of not going against the tenets of the instrument or the way the instrument makes sound, but instead working with it as best you can. So can you think of any composers or pieces that come to mind that students might be able to study to begin to scratch the surface of learning how we write for guitar?
Yeah. Um, I think if I were to kind of divide it up, um, you know, probably if, you know, I had to choose kind of like the greatest living guitar composer, it would have to be the Russian Nikita Koshkin.
Sure.
His compositions are just so well crafted, and they explore the complete range of the instrument. I think his sonata number 2 is exceptional, a really, really exceptional work, both compositionally and, you know, orchestrating and arranging. He's got a piece called Prince's Toys, which explores a lot of the extended techniques for the guitar. You know, you've heard all these before, but if you know, you take a string and you
Sure.
get a drum effect, like a snare drum.
Absolutely.
It,
Yeah.
it, it is his set, The Prince's Toys, explores, you know, just about every extended technique you're going to find. Um, I think, let's see, for if Leo Brouwer, the Cuban composer Leo Brouwer,
Yeah.
he writes really beautiful kind of neotonal music.
Hmm.
Um, it's a little bit more guitaristic, the kind of effects that he gets.
Hmm.
I think your students will be able to hear quickly that, oh yeah, that's like a guitar piece.
Sure. And I think that's something that's really important, especially with guitar. And we're using, Sam Adler's study of orchestration, which
Yeah,
the guitar section is all of a front and back of a page. And they use, in the most recent edition, at least, they use an excerpt from an arrangement of Stravinsky's Tango, which is for electric guitar.
yeah,
And it's a very, very small bit. So they're not even using the Villa Lobos. They're not even using Genestera. They're even getting a little more uh, crunched in
yeah.
because I'm sure there's covering so much other information there. So that's great to have that to have the Brower, to have the other composer that you mentioned as well, to look at
And
to see, these are works that are pushing the edge of what the instrument does, and then also recognizing sort of a larger repertoire for the instrument, even over the last 100 years or beyond.
yeah, I'd also, you know, you mentioned Hinastera. That's a wonderful sonata. That's another one to look at. Toru Takemitsu, the Japanese composer, just beautiful, beautiful writing for the instrument. So, you know, I would include them in there. It's funny you mentioned the Sam Adler book. It's not uncommon to have it skipped over. Even Berlioz, who was a player,
Yeah.
didn't really have too much in
Yeah.
his orchestration book on the guitar. So
Yeah.
it's really difficult. The Stravinsky you mentioned, the one piece that he does have guitar for is Japanese lyrics.
Okay.
It's for harp, guitar, and voice, like maybe clarinet,
Interesting.
I forget. So that's for an ensemble piece.
Hmm.
Georg Kurtag has a beautiful piece for
Yeah.
piccolo, trombone, and guitar. So those are some
Sure.
ensemble pieces too that are really good to look at.
And it's a fun subgroup of mid 20th to late 20th century pieces that also have these string instruments in it. I almost think of some of the 20th century pieces that have mandolin added in as well, like
Yeah,
Webern is one of the first
yeah.
ones that comes to mind, of like really interesting ways of using the instrument. And they are different instruments, but thinking about how we're writing for plucked instruments.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And a lot of guitar players will transfer over so they can, a couple of them can double, like you would might be on an auxiliary instrument if you're playing in a
Sure.
pit band for a musical, right? They're going to be able to switch back and forth. So that's always good. Oftentimes you can talk to them about mandolin or banjo, other types of
Sure.
pluck strings too.
All that very, very fun stuff. Okay, well, thank you so very, very much for this conversation and getting some young orchestrators and arrangers and composers sort of a bit of a glimpse in what it is to be a guitarist and what it is to be a thoughtful musician today in the 21st century. So thank you so very much for your time.
It's great to talk with you, Matt. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thanks so much.